Hi, Philippe. Loving the beard.
Hey,
Papa Smurf.
how's everybody doing?
Very
Very
good.
good. Very good.
Cool.
It's another rainy day in London.
Another rainy day. Yeah, it's raining here also, so
And we are
it's
live.
good.
We're live, guys.
Great.
Great.
We have some great participants, and we're going to talk about challenges we face when migrating to the cloud. And we are our moderator for the session is David Prince. Hello, David. And without further ado, we should just get right into it.
Amazing. Thank you all for joining. I'm David Prince. I'm a security consultant. I have been in, management consulting for several years, but before that in industry as a CISO. And a lot of my time is spent helping organizations kind of approach cloud and specifically cloud security across various aspects of cloud and various challenges. I find lots of my clients are on kind of various stages in their kind of cloud journey. So the thing I really enjoy about it is kind of having conversations that are kind of on the mature end of the spectrum, and then conversations that are on the kind of more kind of immature, less familiar end of the spectrum. So I'm hoping that during this session, migrating to the cloud securely, we can cover an interesting variety of success stories with cloud, some of the challenges we've been facing, the different approaches we're all taking, and what I hope is we can have a good dialogue between us as part of that. So without further ado, I think it would be worth kind of starting with the intended outcome, of which there is only one. Good for me, and I think good for all of us, would be the ability for us to learn from one another. So I don't want to go off on a monologue and start just talking at you all. What I'd much rather is, I guess, set the scene, and we can all kind of share our specific challenges or success stories, everything I mentioned just a few minutes ago, and we can get good dialogue going. So as part of that, I'm happy for people to share any content they've got, take the mic, whatever. It would be great if this can be as fluid as possible. So that's how we're going to achieve the outcome, learning from one another. And ideally, as part of this, we can create some content together. We can get it on GitHub, and we can kind of push it out there to industry to help others who perhaps can't attend this talk. There are a huge list of amazing talks happening at the OSS at the moment, so I'm sure there's a good spread of attendees across all of those. So I guess let's make a start. The premise of the talk is migrating to the cloud securely. There's a lot of things that we can cover within that. And so what I thought we would do is actually, let's take a macro level view of cloud migration. And let's start to identify between us the areas across a migration approach where actually we have particular challenge, whether that's with strategy, whether it's with governance, whether it's with managing risk or determining what your kind of cyber capability model should be. Let's have a conversation across all of these things that are kind of most relevant to you guys. And I think, a good way to perhaps visualize that is just, let's have a look at all the component parts of a migration, how they fit together, and let's start to have a conversation. So I think just before, I guess, we get into all of that detail, there are a number of I guess I would call them kind of axioms that have, for me at least, have held true. But whilst these are fairly high level, they're really, really important. And actually, I've come across situations where perhaps I haven't been aware of these at the point, and I've fallen foul, or actually I have, and actually I've been able to make huge success of cloud migration or taking on specific challenges with cloud. So I'll step through these. If anyone has any comments, anything they want to say, please do shout up. And I think afterwards, when I've gone through these, it'd be great if we can just do a quick, not roll call, but if I can step through the individual challenges that you guys are facing, and I'll read through the participant list, then we can make sure that we're incorporating all of your individual viewpoints and challenges. Because what I don't want is for us to miss an opportunity of talking about specific things that you want to hear about. So I guess I'll make a start, and these aren't in any particular order. But the first for me is when it comes to something as complex as cloud migration. And sure, complexity is relative, but by and large, most migrations are fairly complex. The cybersecurity element to that, like other elements, is all about making the right trade-offs. And in my experience, from a security perspective, those trade-offs tend to be around, I meant to say kind of cyber risk, but I've just put risk, but let's say cyber risk versus the pace of the migration, the benefits you want to get from cloud and by when, the knowledge that you want to have of your current estate to make informed decisions for how you best migrate, and the stability of your services and how involved your stakeholders want and need to be. So typically your kind of risk profile will change if you have a really aggressive pace rather than not having an overly aggressive and more conservative approach. Equally, your risk profile changes if actually you need to move forward quickly, and so therefore there are a number of stakeholders that need to kind of be in the periphery rather than kind of in the heart and center of your migration. And again, if you're heavily regulated and you need to ensure things like service uptime for your business, then stability perhaps becomes more key than other areas. So understanding those, I guess, pinch points that really lead to a kind of a risk position or a risk appetite is really, really important to kind of get right up front. One of the, I guess, tips I can provide in this area is when it comes to defining risk appetite, which can be really hard to do, and sometimes it's not feasible to do it, other times it is try and take a kind of a risk appetite of not everything at once, because it just becomes impossible, but specific end-to-end services that need to be migrated. But we can talk about that later. The second point actually touches on that a little bit, which is where I've seen organizations fall foul of their cloud migration is where they go in too short a time period, huge detail, and they start to think about individual components and servers and assets and migrating them without having a look at kind of an end-to-end view of a service. So if you think of your organization and maybe its value chain or the services end-to-end that are required to keep the business running, and think about the collection of assets and processes and services and dependencies on third parties, all as one single end-to-end view, then you can start to think about how you migrate that end-to-end rather than individual components at any given point. And I've found that to be really, really important, especially when it comes to helping stakeholders kind of come along on that journey, because it's far easier for stakeholders to understand an end-to-end service than it is potentially individual servers and individual kind of third parties and everything else. The third point is, and again, this is probably one of the really common challenges we see across many organizations, is you too fall into this analysis paralysis. There can sometimes be such a huge emphasis on we need to know as much as we possibly can about our current estate before we move to the cloud. Whilst I agree that you need to have an understanding of your current state, there is a point that you reach where you get kind of diminishing returns on that. And I think it's really important to understand at what point do we kind of pivot over towards diminishing returns. We're not getting the value of our time in investing in our current as-is estate. So really important to figure out where you draw the line in the sand when it comes to what you need to know about your current estate to inform decisions for how you move. And we can talk about that over the course of the next few hours. One thing important, I guess, from a cybersecurity perspective as well as others, is just making sure that we're allocating the proportionate amount of time for different things. So I've seen organizations focus a lot of time on areas of complexity in the business that need to be migrated, but where those areas actually carry quite little risk. So yes, it's complex, but actually it's not critical service, they're not critical assets, they're not regulated, they're not kind of, retaining and processing huge quantities of data. It's just there's one area of complexity, and I've seen lots of organizations, and particularly cybersecurity teams, get really, really, really invested in trying to solve problems in areas that aren't that risky, but are complex. I think there's sometimes with some individuals this desire to really demonstrate mastery and get to the bottom of problems, even when it's not necessarily that important. So what I'd say here is, where you allocate time from a cybersecurity perspective, a good principle to follow is inherent risk. What services, not thinking about what controls already exist, what services are heavily regulated, retain lots of sensitive or personal data, have a high dependency on third parties, and need to be operated by different parts of business, whereby actually those aren't in individual teams. So the integration of those individuals is actually quite hard. They represent high inherent risk and probably warrant the time to migrate properly. I hope that makes sense. The fifth point is really understanding your future home. Been seeing lots of organizations not really have a clear target and future state, or kind of interim states in terms of the architecture. We have to remember that when we do cloud migration at kind of mass scale, there is massive opportunity for uplifting cybersecurity capability within that, leveraging native capability in cloud, getting budget to extend the coverage of existing controls we have on-prem. We can't leverage those benefits without having a really clear understanding of what our target state architecture is going to be, what our target state service designs are going to be. So being clear on that is important, but also recognize that this sometimes, depending on your business and the pace at which you need to move, you're not going to have a full picture for everything. So a lot of the time, this needs to be fairly iterative. So start with the kind of the core principles and kind of gradually iterate as you migrate. And then the final point is, and I know it's super noddy and obvious, but if you don't have a plan, all you have is a hope, which I tend to say quite a lot. Lots of organizations that almost feel like kind of cloud migration is a side of desk, or it's a plan within a particular part of the business, but it's not really holistic or comprehensive enough to take the business along that journey. So where we're talking about moving services end to end when you go to cloud, you can't do that if you've only got a cloud migration plan that sits with a security function or a technology function and doesn't take into account lines of business, for example. So they're the 6 axioms that, for me, have held true, been really useful, particularly when engaging with senior leadership in helping kind of set some core principles. Before I guess do a roll call for the audience to understand specific things you want to get from the next few hours we've got together. Did any of that kind of resonate with any of you in terms of challenges that you see or things that you've come across?
I think that the point 5 there, it's like it depends a lot if you go just one cloud or you go multi-cloud. That makes like a whole different problem, right?
Yeah.
Because going multi-cloud is like, okay, you need to know lots of different clouds depending on the client. And also you may want to do things on top of it. I don't know. Sometimes people go for Kubernetes or some solution like that, depending on if it's managed or not, depending if you go for Azure or GCP or sometimes use KOps in AWS. So it depends a lot on what you expect from and what your clients want. Also, sometimes you are, for example, in our case, we have like 2 major cloud providers. So they expect to host some things on their own clouds. And yeah, this is a constant challenge for us in that sense.
Yeah, that's a really good point in terms of multi-cloud. So some of the challenges we see there, I was actually having a conversation not so long ago with an individual, and they were thinking, we've got GCP, we've got AWS, we've got Azure, we've got VMware on-prem. Where do we, in terms of our capability model for cyber, what do we use for what? So, what do we use for identity? What do we use for secrets and keys management? They've all cloud providers have this capability. Do we use all of them? Do we use one? That stuff is really important to try and get right up front, and it can be a challenge. I don't think there is an individual kind of answer for that. A lot of it has to be the context of the business, but I think what that depends on is a knowledge of what capabilities exist across those platforms and how they can be best used for the particular business. But it's a really interesting challenge. I think from an operational perspective, one of the challenges we are definitely kind of running into, and I think to an extent have already met, is just how you manage permissions in multi-cloud, which comes to kind of your identity capability, because the discrepancies and the differences in the permissions you can allocate, of which there are thousands across different platforms, it's not feasible to manage individual permissions across the different platforms. It's really hard. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. Really helpful. Does anyone else have any comments on those 6?
I pasted some stuff into the chat window. Like,
so migration strategies.
The lift and shift, replatforming, and how to use them. How to use a variety of them for a variety of needs.
Yep. I think that's something that would be good for us to explore. And I think that comes back to the kind of where we kind of identify these on the approach for the different options you've got, the rehosting, replatform, if you use hybrid or you go kind of all in. I guess before we start to, I guess, pick at individual parts of this approach, I'm conscious that I'm really keen to understand specific challenges from individuals so we can get that kind of covered off. So, I mean, shall we run through those? I mean, Lewis, if you're there, if you could perhaps recap on what you're looking to get out of the session, and Philippe and James, Matthew, if we could do the same with you guys as well, that'd be really helpful.
Sure. This is Lewis. I work for a car manufacturer, and one of the challenges we have relates mostly to the risk appetite. So what we have right now is a very heavy weighted process for going into the cloud. So we are, it's a German company, so it's very risk averse. So they want to be sure that everything is okay. And then there's a lot of stakeholders, legal, liability, I don't know, procurement, security, corporate security. It's just a bunch of people meddling in something they don't necessarily understand. And they all have goalposts. You have to comply with different things from all of these stakeholders. And they would like to assess for every single cloud initiative, what's the security posture of AWS, of Azure, of IBM Cloud, or SAP Cloud. And those are our 4 strategic cloud service providers. In my opinion, we need to do one single assessment for Azure, AWS, and whatever not, because of the shared responsibility model. The security posture coming or derived from these partners will not really change regardless of the service. That which in the end will make or break any initiative is the security in the cloud, that which you are building. And the process is very waterfall in its approach, in that you have to show everything before you even start. So before you even start building in the cloud, you have to show how it will look like, which is opposite to DevOps, opposite to Agile methodology. So that's basically the biggest challenge, how to reduce friction, to make an informed decision that has some relation to what is being built and according to the risk appetite. So that's more or less what the situation I have and what I'm trying to optimize.
Sure, it sounds like a real challenge you've got, but I think in essence, what you're describing there is a very low appetite for risk that perhaps is a bit misplaced, where your stakeholders want to reassess the cloud platform for every initiative. I mean, how long does that take? Like for some of your projects, is that added like weeks and months to satisfy your stakeholders?
Not months, but every single initiative has to go through a legal check and an IT security check. And we are basically or mostly looking at the cloud service provider risk and way too little into the security in the cloud. And that's where I say we need to get better at this. We cannot keep on doing the shared responsibility model wrong every single time.
Yeah, completely understand. Thank you for taking the time there, Lewis. That's really helpful. And hopefully, as a group, we can start to talk about that. I'm making a note of some of these challenges. Philippe, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I work for a US company in the field of people analytics in a way. So yeah, because of contracting and all sorts of stuff, as Luis mentioned, we have some restraints and going full cloud. We are hoping to, but it depends on of course, contracts and so on. We have some of our internal infrastructure in the cloud, but also had started some time ago. And also you have a different archaeological layers there. So once you begin moving to the cloud, it should be very good if you start thinking about early how you're going to achieve the migration and what's the different aspects you need to take into account. But normally, this is not the process that you follow. It depends a lot on your reality, but normally you begin with some of the services on the cloud, those you can handle, and by contracting you are not restrained and so on, and then more services go along, so you begin to this partial migration of stuff, and then you begin think it's not like you cannot go in a full waterfall model unless you have the whole time to do it and to begin at the start thinking about, okay, I'm going this way and that way. Sometimes you need to leverage some full runs, and you need the computing power, so you need the cloud for that. So it's kind of this is a good approach, but sometimes you begin early, and then you begin thinking, okay, I should have thought about this before, but the business, it's like pushing forward and so on. So you have to deal with both aspects of the risk.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's challenging in a way. And afterwards, when you decide what are you going to build, then you need to be sure that maybe the original things that you put into the cloud some time ago, and you need to think about all the risks that implies about doing that, and how are you going to do the version 2.0 of that in a new environment, for example. So it's kind of very challenging on beginning. If you can start from zero, from scratch, it's super cool. But sometimes you begin with some of your services, the more internal ones, not maybe client facing, but yeah, that's a real challenge for us.
That's really helpful. I think the key points I got from that were, you've got some things in the cloud already, but you've got some kind of real constraints you're trying to get over, and a lot of that comes down to the pace at which you can move some things to the cloud quickly. You can't do waterfall, which obviously that makes total sense. But I guess what you're trying to determine is what are the things that you can move to cloud really quickly. Is it kind of a relative order of priority that you're trying to establish?
Yeah, of course, and also, yeah, that implies that you need to talk about contract with clients and whatnot, and that's a different process. It's run by a different group, and yeah, you need to plan for going to the cloud, but also the aspect that I mentioned before. Okay, we might want to think about multi-cloud from the start, because in this case we will need it, and what are the options, what are the support and infrastructure that makes sense for every cloud. And you mentioned the aspect of AAA, and that's a whole mess. And yeah, it's a real challenge, and it's a nice challenge to have.
It is actually. It's certainly one of the most interesting challenges. There is that benefit at least. Thank you, Philippe, for running through. That's helpful. James, do you want to give a few minutes on that's what you want to get out of the session, and if possible, any challenges you've come across?
Sure. I work in a financial services industry, and I'm just here to learn from other people's experience. That's pretty much it.
Great. Okay. And do you have any, in terms of the things that you want to learn, is there a particular area of interest? Is it more on the technical side, the process side? Do you have any
It
views?
would probably be more on the technical side. My background is in application security, so.
Got it. Okay.
Applications, in the cloud, I guess.
Understood. And hopefully we can use some of the session to talk about then the security capabilities that can be leveraged. So let's see how we get on. Thanks, James. Matthew, if you're on, do you want to give a few minutes?
Hiya. It's probably gonna be a little bit brief for me. I'm at the start of my cloud journey, really, at the moment. So I'm just here looking to see the pitfalls others have fallen down and what I can learn from them and how to secure my environments going forward, really.
Great. Okay, pitfalls. I love that. I'm sure we've all got between us some pitfalls that we can share.
Well, I've already got a few of my own. So
great. Do you want to share a few that you've come across?
mine have been less security and more just getting involved straight away. A lot of the low-level stuff to do with the networking and things, where I've ended up like neglecting namespaces and stuff, and ended up in whole worlds of hell getting things connected to each other and communicating.
Got it. Okay. All right. So more into the kind of the implementation.
Yes, very much so at the moment.
No worries. All right. That's all massively helpful in terms of the things that you're all trying to get out of the session. I think that we can definitely satisfy all of those areas. What we could start with, maybe we can have a discussion around between us some of the first points that Lewis was talking about, which was, I think, a lot of it around risk appetite. So how can you? So I've got things in front of my screen. Get out of the way. How can you establish a governance regime within your business that has the right balance between being diligent and prudent, but also reducing the need to constantly repeat processes and operate at pace? And I think a lot of that comes down to having a defined risk appetite, for sure. Lewis, where you said that's kind of a key area for you, have you a defined risk appetite in that kind of informs the governance regimes that you have, or is it kind of discussed at the time there's a new initiative?
Well, the definition of risk appetite is what is interesting here, right? So what is what constitutes a risk appetite? So there is a risk matrix, like you probably know, impact from very low to very high, and likelihood of occurrence from very low to very high, more or less. 5x5 matrix, just standard. And if you're in any of the red tags, you're basically fried. You need to go all the way to the board of management to get approval. If you're anywhere in yellow or green, you might go, but you might have different levels of sign-off based on where you are. But the question, well, not the question, but I mean the question I pose inside the company is, okay, but if we're mostly focusing on the security posture of our cloud service provider, are we actually achieving our risk appetite rating, or are we actually achieving a risk appetite that's meaningful based on whatever is being built across the company? Because that's, for me, is the key question. So what are we building? How good a job are we doing it in about securing it? and then you put that on top of the other one, which is a known badness or goodness indicator. I mean, Amazon is probably doing things a lot better than pretty much any other data center there is in the world.
Yeah.
Same goes for Azure, and same goes for maybe IBM as well. So why do we need to assess that again and again and again? Oh, because legal says that we need to ask about the contract. Yeah, well, why do I have to ask about the contract? I mean, we know the contract clauses. It's part of the business agreement. So we already went in business with them. We know the contract clauses. Why do I need to ask them again? And then we have the most absurd situation in which the contract was signed in Germany. The language of the country is German. So whenever the colleagues in Singapore ask to see the clauses of the contract, guess what they get? German clauses, German contracts. Oh, fantastic. How many colleagues speak German in Singapore? Well, about as many as speak Chinese in Germany. Not that many. So that kind of slows down the approach. So yes, there is a defined risk appetite, but I'm not sure it is actually measuring what we think it is measuring.
That's a really interesting point you make there, Lewis, and I've got some thoughts on that for sure. It would be good to, I guess, that's posed to us as a group. What do we think about that kind of challenge? Do anyone want to share any insights or thoughts?
Yeah, I was challenging Dida because she works in the risk management area. So I would like to know what's her insights about this normally.
Dida, are you there?
Maybe
I am here.
Yes.
Great. Do you want to share some thoughts? I can chime in as well afterwards.
That's great. I have not really been involved in cloud migration programs myself, but I work alongside the architects who do get involved. But from the risk perspective, it's always about, starts with the assets, as you have mentioned in your axioms. Know what you have, and that is usually where we get stuck. Because then it becomes a really, really big exercise of trying to identify all the assets, and then you almost quit doing it because it's just endless.
Yes. Yeah, that right balance is key.
And that is not just, that's not unique to cloud migration. It's an ongoing concern. But from risk, it's where I start. Yeah,
absolutely. I think, Lewis, when I was hearing you, I guess, share, I think in some detail the challenge you're coming across, it kind of, I agree with your point that the focus of attention regarding risk seems to be somewhat misplaced, perhaps, looking at the provider rather than the services that you are provisioning, using, and managing yourselves as a business. Because, let's face it, we all know that's typically where the risk lies in realistic terms. And you described your kind of standard 5x5 risk matrix. But I mean, for me, that helps to inform a risk position that then links to a risk appetite, right? So where I think about risk appetite, I tend to have the term which is, the potential for harm that a business is willing to accept in pursuit of its goals. And what's really key for that is context. So if you have a risk matrix and a 5x5, and you're saying, what this risk is, it's a 25 or whatever it might be. What can be quite useful in terms of bringing it to life is having some business impact statements that are relevant to your business. And so what you can do through your stakeholders, through your governance, is say, here are a series of business impact statements that are relevant to our cloud migration and us as a business operating in the cloud. Let's step through, and sometimes you can do this almost on a scale of 1 to 10. If you do it with the right people in the room, you just need some way to either qualitatively or quantitatively draw a line in the sand and understand what the, I guess, what the variances are. So typically you can find, if you're going through some risk appetite statements, business impact statements, and you've got kind of maybe people land on a 5, which is, they're open to think about accepting risk, but are quite cautious. You may find as a group, some people lean towards being more cautious and others lean towards being more kind of risk averse or risk accepting. But when you kind of gauge where people sit along that bar can be quite useful. What's really key for me is if you just have the 5 by 5 kind of in isolation, it doesn't really bring the risk to life. It doesn't really tell you what the scenario is that you're trying to mitigate, what the consequential kind of harm might be realistically. And therefore, it kind of is quite difficult for people to determine what risk they're willing to accept, because when you think about risk, it's not all bad, right? You're thinking about the other point of this is the more risk you accept, then the greater potential for you to receive the benefits that you want in a quicker time period, which is why that balance is really, really important. So, Lewis, when you go through your kind of 5 by 5s, and I guess we'll touch on whether it's at the provider or at yourselves in a minute, but when you go to the 5 by 5, does that link to a series of appetite statements that have been developed in your business?
Yes, sort of. I mean, the security architects produce the 5 by 5.
Mm-hmm.
Legal produces on its own a different 5 by 5 based on legal whatever. And then the business owner of the unit takes a look at both and either determines the process owner takes a look at both and determines whether the business owner can sign it, whether that has to be elevated, and how high up the ladder it has to be elevated. They actually, I'm actually not sure how deep they look into the statements. From my understanding, they just look at the 5 by 5 coming from IT security and the 5 by 5 coming from legal, and just push the token somewhere else to deal with it.
Sure. I think there might be a real opportunity there, and I don't want to speculate and second guess too much, because of obviously we don't know your business, but where, I guess I'm drawing parallels to some other areas of experience, but where I've helped clients, I guess, really look at their risk management processes and their governance, you often find that these aren't new processes in the business. They've been built over time, and they come with certain attitudes and behaviors that are applied to new projects, new initiatives, new capabilities, and new strategies, and that comes with a lot of bias. That isn't good when you're trying to objectively measure and make risk-based decisions. So what can be quite useful, and maybe just one to think over, I suppose, and I guess I could put on some examples as well on the GitHub page if it's helpful for you. There's an opportunity to get the stakeholders together. This relies on people being available and willing, and to start listing more higher level business leadership type scenarios for you to then gauge the level of appetite for those groups of stakeholders. And you can embed within that, what is our appetite to accelerate the use of cloud if the use of cloud falls within known criteria. Because I think the issue you're describing is, even when you're using the cloud for a new initiative that is almost exactly the same as another initiative that's already been approved, just because it's a new initiative, it's got to go through that whole rigmarole all over again. And there's an opportunity there for you to kind of have that as an almost a risk statement, to really help people kind of stop, think about how they've been doing this over the past kind of X number of months or years, and whether or not that's a suitable thing to do. Because, yeah, I mean, what you described, there's a lot of time waste in that, and I guess it's not that efficient. Do you think that's something could be helpful? Because maybe we can share some content.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you want, we can give everyone a chance to speak up, and then we can come back and can show something. Just not to take up all the time.
Awesome. Does anyone have any thoughts? Ben, I know you've just joined, and
yeah, sorry, I was on another call. I mean, and I don't know if you've talked about this, but I think one of the key things for me is when you move to cloud is your risk changes. So I think people, the great thing about the cloud is the agility and the ability to spin up and spin down stuff very quickly. But that same agility is also quite a change where people have been used to, you know, a waterfall approach and quite slow release processes. So I think, yeah, I guess my concern whenever I see the 5x5, that heat map kind of risk matrix, is it should be quantified. So my background was in the city in London market insurance, and you'd never have someone say, oh, it's a green risk. It would be, you know, we're going to write this premium for this risk. And similarly, when you're, you know, marking to market on an asset management fund, you know, you have to do that legally at the end of the day. So you can do qualitative risk assessment, but I think the only way of really driving the right behaviors is to get people to treat it the same as any financial risk. Cyber risk is the same as any financial risk, and to actually start doing some quantification. So there's stuff that Phil Huggins is talking about with the kind of the Monte Carlo simulations and how you get people to agree, because it's how you get that engagement. People often see, for me, cyber security as being a binary risk. You know, you breach, you're not breached, and you can't protect against everything. So it's whether it's something that is just an obvious, yeah, it's an issue we're just going to do, like antivirus, or it's a risk we need to analyze and work out what our response is, or whether we're saying, listen, we can't afford to pay to protect against it. No one's going to write the risk, but we need to have resilience and be able to respond to it. So, you know, that would be the dynamic that changes when you get to cloud is suddenly, you know, you can have the speed of change from an attacker's point of view is a big change.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of quantitative risk assessment. Actually, I'm trying to go through it. And one of the problems I see as an industry is there isn't that much data. Of course, that's I've read the book, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity.
Yeah, we've all read that one.
So of course you can start with logouts ratio, independent things, mix them up. So what I'm coming up right now with is the curves for probability of facing one attacker and probability of facing an event caused by this kind of attacker. So you have the probability of E and the probability of event given X1, for example, the attacker, the capabilities, the motivation. Even though Huygens said that the motivation is not important, if you look at a vehicle, for example, who would hack a vehicle? I mean, even if it is available for everyone, I know my grandmother or my father would not try to hack the vehicle because he lacks the motivation. There is no motivation, there's no win for him doing that. Whereas for someone that is doing chip tuning as a service, I give you a couple more horsepower for your vehicle. There's a big motivation there, right? But that's more organized criminality. They have a business model behind it. Just a casual attacker will not, the driver who might brick his vehicle. I mean, would you be willing to tamper with your vehicle 40, 50, 60,000 euro just for fun? Probably not. Right? So,
I mean, and also you shouldn't be allowed to do that. That's not your choice.
Yeah, give me a second. My children are driving crazy with a walkie-talkie. Sorry.
Yeah. Are you sure it's your children? It's not an attacker.
I'm very sure it's my children. I recognize those voices. Yeah. So what I'm trying to work with, and what we just kicked off was trying to look more at risk management with FAIR, the FAIR methodology, risk lens.
Yeah.
That might help to create loss exceedance curves, which is a better way to measure risk in the end.
I mean, where this connects with people in the technology community is, and I've done several of these, is you get asked to fill in the cyber insurance brief for the broker. So again, you know, that's for me quite often the CISO is treated a bit like a breaker fuse, you know, a circuit breaker. So, you know, someone turns around and says to Dennis, "Are we okay?" From the board, and he goes, "Yeah, we're okay," until something isn't okay, and then suddenly, you know, "Dennis, you didn't tell us it was wrong." And I think you'd never do that in financial terms, in terms of what the CFO is doing in terms of hedging foreign exchange, or in terms of your marking of assets. So it's how you get that same quantitative framework established, and people realize they can't just ignore the cyber side of it, especially when it gets cloud. That you actually have to be engaged in not just talking about your risk appetite, but quantifying it.
Yes, and the quantification aspect itself is challenging because it smells of statistics. And because it smells of mathematics, and there is a general aversion in the general population against mathematics, whenever I propose this, I just face faces that are like, oh, this is approaching almost like I don't know, like paranormal activity. So I don't understand it. Don't talk to me about it. It's magic, basically.
Well, everyone wants to pay for their fire insurance after they've had the fire, and this is the problem is that there's smoke in the building. Everyone knows this stuff is going on. You shouldn't just say, the building is smoking, now I'm going to buy my fire insurance. But what level of protection do you put in? Because you can't protect against everything.
Of course not. But then the question is, if you're doing the assessment, so the risk assessors, they need to understand that the mathematical calculation will happen behind the scenes. So you need a core group of people who understand mathematics to do the models. Yeah. And then you need a group of people who can work with the model without worrying so much on the mathematics behind it. And that's something that I think whenever I talk about this in the company, not everyone understands.
But that's really...
Everyone wants an assurance. Everyone wants to know, is the model right? How did you come up with this number? Are there really that many or that little APTs, and is that the right level of success chances for an APT? Well, I don't know. Let's go with this. Do you want to challenge the assumption? Challenge it. Let's go with this, and let's feedback from the field, from our assessment, from our experience later, the model, and adjust the curves. But that's right now the biggest challenge I'm facing.
It's a really interesting challenge that you're facing there, and from everything you described, the challenge around your risk management processes and governance is absolutely impeding your ability to perhaps find that right balance for how you migrate to cloud. I'm not surprised at all that if you presented a kind of quantitative risk analysis of core elements of that it's kind of been looked at in a weird way and not kind of served you, I guess, the outcome that you were looking for, because you see time and time again individuals who do their kind of the risk assessment, and it deviates from what is known and understood in the risk management practice of that business. And when that happens, it doesn't end well. The journey to go through is, as a business, we need to change the way in which we look at risk and measure risk. And I wonder if, and I think there are a lot of kind of social elements to this, which is if your leadership are looking for assurance, there's a conversation to be had around, we need to give some assurance around what we plan to do in cloud. How can we best present that to you? And then work collaboratively to then agree on how that's going to be assessed. Because otherwise, if you're presenting a risk model that has various calculations and assumptions within it, and that's being imposed on the individuals who are making decisions, who perhaps aren't familiar, perhaps feel alienated by it, perhaps feel exposed because they don't know it, you tend to find that, I guess maybe in my experience, that behavior associated with being exposed will override any kind of objective decision. So maybe there's an element of, how do we work with the risk management business or part of the business to agree on how we can better quantify the risk together?
This also really applies to supply chain. So if you're in a supply, what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is a media supply chain, and you've got 5,000-6,000 players in that supply chain, and how do you make sure that you've got equivalence? Because what you're doing there is your assets are being checked out and put into a small languaging unit somewhere in Italy. How do you assure your risk of your security across all of those things as well? So we've just talked about the challenges of culturally how you get the people involved with quantified risk, which they're already doing on financial risk for sure, and insurance they're doing it. How do you get them to extend their scope to cyber? And that's fine if you're a software as a service business. you can't avoid it. You've got to do this. As soon as you do any RFP, you've got to have to show that you've thought about it and what your continuity is. But a traditional business will try and avoid engaging with, because, as you say, it's scary maths. But they, in the same way, they wouldn't say, oh, we don't want to look at the mechanics of foreign exchange, so we're not going to hedge our currency risk. So it should be treated in the same way.
Yes, in principle, I know, I understand. We're all in the same channel. It's just bridging it across that's causing trouble, and sometimes the trouble is you're discussing with engineers, people designing vehicles. You're discussing it with engineers. They agree with you in principle, but they would like to have another opinion, not yours, someone else, to look at the model to see if you're trying to peddle them something dangerous.
Yeah.
And everyone has insurance. The problem is no one has gone through the trouble of calculating the actuarial tables for placing risk based on whatever activities you have, right? So other industries know
there are actuarial tables, but I would challenge that if we got a bunch of actuaries on cyber insurance in a room, they probably, their hair would be white if they were listening to what we were talking about here, because it shows that some of the assumptions they're making, and London market insurance are used to very weird risks, but my guess is that the practice of risk assessment that we're going through here is not something that is maybe surfaced in that financial instrument, which is cyber risk.
And I think that's because there's not enough statistics and data. We were discussing that in another session as well.
But the only way of us getting that kind of that feedback loop, and what's really interesting is you talk about feedback. So again, I'm very last 30 years, everyone talks about saying we're going to measure our ROI on this investment, and then we're going to we justify a business case on it. The number of people that at the end of a project actually count the real costs and then go back to the original assumptions and not just work out whether it was it met the needs or not, but then adjust their assumption base for the next project is tiny. So I think we're talking about something quite fundamental here, and it's how do you make this in a way that's easy to manage? So the Monte Carlo simulation stuff, how you present that to the board so that they are, that they're still making their judgment and you're supporting that judgment rather than it being here's an automatic algorithm, because that isn't going to work. Yeah. It's about judgment.
Completely agree, and how you articulate that is really critical. The amount of board engagements you see where on the one hand you see someone presenting something that is technically absolutely correct, but without the right narrative, immediately the response from a board is fairly negative. So the narrative and the way you engage is so critical. If that's what the Monte Carlo talk is about, I guess I'd employ everyone to attend that, because I think it'd be really valuable.
Yeah. And again, I don't think there's an answer at the moment, but I think this is an area that this is the real meat of any justification. So people look at security and you cap a budget for security as a function. I'll talk today about Disney and the supply chain, but Disney have got 40,000 people in media and entertainment, and there's a 40-man security team. Now that's quite a big team of specialists, and that's 1 in 1,000. When you start looking at the supply chain, you got the median size being less than 100. How many security experts are you going to get in that supply chain? So for a media point of view, where your assets are leaving the building every time someone touches it, then you have a real risk, and that should be quantified. But there are other businesses that are better at doing this, and cloud, I think, has some positive impacts on this, because you can then bring the tools and the skills to the work rather than having to shift the work out. But it's there's some new approaches needed for cloud. Just one question on control frameworks for cloud, and just again, I'm going to talk about this, but in terms of looking at the control frameworks and the overlap between control frameworks, how many people here are using Cloud Security Alliance?
I know we are. So we actually mapped from the ENISA study from cloud risk and cloud risk assessment or something like that. It's called an ENISA, the European Information Security Agency.
Yeah.
They had in 2010 a study that was published. It's freely available.
Yeah.
So we went through the trouble of mapping the threat categories, the vulnerabilities from this, and the matching controls from the CSA CCM. So the Cloud Controls Matrix from the Cloud Security
CCM
Alliance.
301, yeah.
Yes, so we have gone through the trouble of mapping all these three things together for our cloud assessment.
But the issue with the CCM is there are only 4 controls on software development, and with cloud, you know, whether it's infrastructure as code, whether it's your integration, or whether it's your software as a service, those are all the attack vectors. So unless you're controlling your code of deployment in cloud, then you have a problem. And that's one. I mean, obviously, CSA is something that's written for a cloud platform providers and about the shared responsibility. But what I've done is incorporate OWASP ASVS as being the critical control for software development. But and if you have hybrid environment, then you have things that are really coming from the CIS control. So I'm trying to blend those controls together. But it'd be very interesting to talk about your mapping exercise and how it's like a whole different bunch of religions we've got here. So we're talking here about what your risks are. But for me, the other side of the risk is the control, which is your mitigation, and how do you keep that those controls up to date. So with something like an ISAC where new vulnerabilities are coming in, how do you make sure you've got that closed loop feedback?
Yeah, it's I mean, what I was discussing in the beginning is we have 2 levels of assessment. One is the cloud service provider risk, the inherent risk of the cloud service provider, which is what we try to measure with the ENISA study or whatever we derived out of it. So of course, the countermeasures from the CCM are matched against this cloud service provider environment.
Yeah.
And we just made our own fork of the ASVS, which we are enhancing and matching to our internal policies, with the purpose of sometime in the future having at least a set of standard controls that everyone can implement in their own CI pipeline to check against some of these things at least. So that's how we're approaching it. And of course, the security architects are taking care of the security in the cloud.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
So in the shared responsibility model, we try to balance it. So of course, every initiative, every system that is being built, I call them the Frankensteins. So you get a piece of this, a piece of that, a piece of this, and my own code a little bit, and I put them all together like a Frankenstein, and then I send this monster into the world. So
it lives.
Yeah, so it lives, right? So this is something that you cannot really measure with one static assessment. So that's where threat modeling comes in. That's why we have over 100 security architects that go through a training path, through a certification path to become security architects and then do these assessments, not just for cloud, but for anything that touches the internet at least.
So that's another really interesting point about frequency of audit. So because you can no longer rely on well, especially in supply chain, you can't rely on an auditor walking through the door and saying, yeah, you're secure, and then everyone relaxes and waits for the next year. So how do you make sure that what you're assessing or from your audit is your continuing, your continuous development, your continuous assurance? You're looking at the process, and how do you get that data out without exposing that to an attacker? So because that's the data you really want to see. You want to make sure you've got a dashboard on how people are applying the process within the components you're deploying in the cloud. That's fine when you get something like an Amazon, because you're a tree in the forest. You'd expect the SEC and the CIA to be first in the queue, and therefore you're kind of slipstreaming behind them. But when you start then having a bunch of other small vendors, which might be 10, 20, 30-man companies, how do you make sure they're not just in a feature race trying to get stuff out the door to win the next RFP? How do you make sure they really are baked in security?
Just on that, Lewis, it sounded like you were kind of describing how you're leveraging compliance as code. So just embedding those checks, if you like, within your CI/CD pipeline. Is that did I hear correctly there?
I want to drive us in that direction. So right now we just have we have just forked with the beginning of the COVID crisis. I had a lot of free time because everyone else was on short work times. So I had a lot of time. I forked the ASVS. Then as my colleagues went back on to work, we started working on that. and we're now in the process of making that a policy for application development.
That's amazing. And when I was listening to that, I was thinking about, and I guess for everyone else listening, there is so much opportunity that can be leveraged with your cloud migration when you start to talk about those capabilities. So, you know, when it comes to kind of control mapping and validating the application and effectiveness across controls frequently across your cloud estate, without the capability that kind of compliance as code offers, that's a massive task. It can be it can add a lot of overhead. It can be very costly. And what you might want to consider doing, and I found this to be really helpful for organizations kind of exploring cloud migration and the benefit of some of the capabilities they can leverage, is working with the stakeholders to help them understand the balance of the benefits they can get and the risk they're willing to accept to get there. And so what might be quite useful is separating opportunities and risk. So, and I know risk is obviously both, but just kind of run with me here a second. You can run with your stakeholders and say, here are a list of opportunities that are relevant to us as a group. Which opportunities mean the most to us? Which ones do we want to run at to fully leverage? And compliance as code is a massive capability in that area to cut down on time, resource, having more assurance because you're running more frequent checks, and the ability to quickly kind of tear down and recreate infrastructure and configuration. Depending on the responses to those kind of opportunity statements, let's say, you can then start to run through the risks. And what becomes quite interesting is you'll begin to identify where your stakeholder group has said, actually, yeah, absolutely, we're scoring in the top right of these opportunities that we want to get, but conversely, we're not willing to accept any risk to get there. And that is a great way to help your stakeholders realize that actually they perhaps need to change their risk appetites and how they're perceiving risks individually. The quantification will really help, of course, but that helps almost a self-realization within your stakeholders that could help.
And apologies, guys, I'll go drop for another call, but very interesting. Sorry to jump in and jump out, but looking forward to the session this afternoon.
Okay, see you.
Cheers.
Ben.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you. So just to that end, if it's helpful, we've got some kind of opportunity and risk statements that might be helpful that can be shared.
I mean, I don't have it in that kind of phrasing, but it's interesting to use it, leverage it as you suggest. Yes, I mean, the topic of compliance as code, I'm still trying to figure out how to best implement it, and of course, I need a couple of guinea pigs to try it out.
Sure. Yeah. So I think there's a talk on that. I think I'm facilitating it in an hour or so. So that might be useful.
Yeah. So that is something that I would really like to better feel, because I suppose there's 150 or 120 requirements in level 1 from the ASVS.
Yeah.
So that's just too many. So how many of these are trivial to implement and are agnostic of the programming language? So if I can get a hold of this and then get a bunch of people to help me program them, then you get something that you can embed in pretty much any test framework and have checks for that. So Mario Platt usually talks about checking cookies or TLS or something like that. Well, those are very simple things to test. The problem is, how do you test them in your CI? So you actually have to have the container running to see if it's got the TLS, and so that's more like a runtime QA run that has to go not at build time, but right after build time as part of the battery of tests that are done by the team. So these kind of opportunities, I require someone to test them with, because working in the central governance authority in the ivory tower, I don't have projects myself to test with.
Sure. Okay. That becomes a challenge. I totally understand. that's been a really useful conversation, going kind of along the lines of, I guess, largely around risk and some of the security benefits of cloud. I'm conscious that, Philippe, you mentioned some of the restraints that you've been facing, and the kind of order of priority in which you move stuff to the cloud. Maybe it's worth us having a conversation more on that, and kind of draw on our collective experiences around that particular challenge. Do you want to restate, Philippe, just for the benefit of everyone, the specific challenge you're facing?
Yeah, well, we kind of have some of our internal infrastructure, not client-facing infrastructure, on the cloud already. So one of the things that we have is that depends a lot on the age when it was created, if it follow the of full requirements of what we were doing. Sometimes there was even created using the popular tools like Terraform. We kind of now try to use Terraform for everything, because if you're going for multi-cloud approaches, you think about using a tool that help you in the way. So you can have at least the same set of conformance, and also you can write tests and prove things using Terraform and Teratest and so on. Also, we began adopting things lately on checking resources using Terraform. There's a tool, very well-known tool called Chekhov. So we try to adopt some tools in our CI/CD to try to get the best of our resources in the cloud, and try to figure out if we are following all the recommended setups and settings. And that's been a long journey between trying to find out what we need to move from. There are also architectural decisions sometimes, because of course you want to get the full, moving to kind of EC2 or kind of a host service in that way, a full compute service it's maybe the easiest way to do it, but you're just changing your hosted corporate servers in your DC maybe to the cloud only. But if you want to take a full approach and leverage of the whole thing in the cloud, you just begin rethinking architecturally what you're doing sometimes, and how taking the best benefit from the cloud, and so this implies a lot of rethinking, and then you go backwards and seeing, okay, what's the process we are going to follow. And of course you begin with additional risks, because this is kind of a loop. I kind of find you can go in a waterfall and thinking beforehand all the risk if you know everything. It's like when you're developing, and yeah, if you go into an agile situation in which your requirements change, or your architectural settings will change because you see the benefit of using a different tool or a different provider. So it's kind of you need to think about, and you're doing that in the process, and it takes some time, and you also need to see what are the risks of adopting that tool specifically. So from our point of view, going to the cloud has this lots of risk. Of course, we are trying to measure everything, but it's not. We are not even done with all the risks that we're measuring, because this is a process that's taking back and forth between all the teams, and doing architectural designs, and doing it's kind of a mess right now, in the sense that that takes a long time to get all the risks wherever they want to be, and wherever we want to have them in well documented and so on. So it's like we have some approaches. We have been dealing with some risks in the process. We have been adding tools for mitigating those risks and trying to get the things in place. I'm also very interested in the fork that you did, Luis, of the ASBS. Is that something that you have different control sets sometimes, but is that something that gets into between level 1 and 2, between level 2 and 3? Your requirements ask you to have something in the middle, because that's very useful.
The requirements from the ASVS, what I have tried to do is to simplify the requirements that you need based on your information classification. So if you have CIA plus internet facingness plus, I don't know, whatever you want to add on top, privacy or some other classification. So you have several degrees of freedom. Every degree of freedom introduces, I don't know, confidentiality 4 levels, integrity 2 levels, availability 4 levels, and so on. So based on this, you end up with a permutation of approaches that if you try to look up in a policy document, you just go crazy. You have no idea what you want to do. So what I've tried to do is simplify it. I'll put them in a bucket and say, level 1. You do not touch the internet and you are not confidential, integrity critical, or availability critical in any way. So you're just plain, boring, 3-tier application developed in the 90s, serving only employees. Okay, we get it. There's some exposition because it's horrible, but you just have to do this much. As soon as you put this thing in the internet, as soon as this thing touches the internet, then you have to go to level 2. Or if you're confidential, you have to go to level 2. Or if you're integrity, availability critical, you're level 2. Now, if you take one of the level 2s and put them in the internet, if they were not internet facing, or you have secret data that is critical to the organization, then you're automatically level 3. So the amount of requirements to do is like 120 for level 1, 120 for level 2, and just like 40 more for level 3. So it's not too much burden for level 3. But if you get at least level 1 done, it's okay. And it's more about, it's a verification standard. So it's things that you have to do. It's not about particular control. So how you do it, how you achieve the result is pretty much up to you. And the beauty of this thing is it's all defined in Markdown, and you can export out of the Markdown JSON, CSV, PDFs, Word, Excel, whatever you need. So based on who your constituents are, you can create for management, pretty looking PDFs, for information security officers, Excel sheets so that they have something to check because they love checking boxes. And for developers, you have JSON that they can integrate into Jira, or they have CSV or whatever it is that works better than a PDF. So for me, PDF is the format in which data goes to die. And I try to move out of this data cemetery into something that people actually want to work with.
PDFs is where data goes to die. Is that what you just said?
Yeah.
Yes, it's where data goes to die. Anything you have in a PDF is death.
Oh yeah, I don't disagree. It's just I've never heard it phrased like that, and I like it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, the benefits of using Pandoc for everything is amazing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So have you? I mean, maybe it's going towards the kind of the compliance as code conversation that we have scheduled later on, but and maybe it doesn't quite relate. So apologies if I'm misunderstanding. But you know, a key hurdle to get over when it comes to embedding these types of checks in the CI/CD pipeline is taking those requirements and using kind of behavioral-driven development, so you can translate those requirements in a way that can be used within, say, DevSecOps. Is that something that you've had to overcome?
To be honest, every time there's a very nice project from OWASP, cloud security, it's called. And I've made a fork of that one as well, and I've tried to like make it popular, and that's how I try to share information within the company. So we made like a threat model for MQTT, message queues. So what is a common threat when you're using message queues within the company? We commissioned one for Kubernetes. There's the one from Microsoft as well for Kubernetes, and there's a few more. So how do you share details which are confidential in nature with the rest? Well, you have to abstract them away from the system they were found, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the threat model of the system is not publicly shared because it's confidential by itself or of itself. But what you share is the things that might be common topics for everyone, and this can be described in Gherkin well, it's not a programming language, but you know Gherkin.
Pseudocode, right?
Yeah, so it's you have like your clauses, the action, and the outcome of these things whenever they happen in this logical, structured way. And the thing is, no one is using it. So I talk to everyone. Everyone finds it fantastic, but no one is using it. And whenever I ask the security architects, well, how are you then creating tickets in Jira? Oh, free text. Okay, please tell me how is that different from Gherkin and TDD or DDD, whatever you want to call it. What you use Gherkin for? Oh, well, I do it like this. Well, but do you think it's well structured? Look, if you follow the structure from Gherkin, in which you have your verb here, your preconditions, your verb, your action, and your outcome, and your actors and whatever, isn't it that more understandable for the developers? Oh yeah, you're right. Actually, it is. Yeah, well, can you contribute back to the project? I still have to hear from one pull request, right? So there are very good initiatives, but they just don't follow. And using Gherkin, you can make them part of the Robo framework or any other such test frameworks. So there's a lot of potential. The problem is developers need to talk the same language, and some developers, if you're outsourcing, well, God knows what they're doing, right?
Yeah, the outsourcing point is a good one.
And now you have DevOps. So you outsourced what? Dev, and who's doing ops? Oops.
Yeah.
And so that's the biggest challenge I'm facing. I got people commissioning work, but they're doing it in an agile fashion, but they only release every 3 months. Well, is that agile really? And so water scrumfall is very marked. So that's kind of my daily windmill I go to fight and die against.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, that is literally around just embedding habits, and embedding habits is really difficult, right? I mean, habits, depending on what the habits are, can be just deeply rooted within individuals. The only resolution I've ever seen to that in terms of changing those habits is to apply governance and to track it as a metric and give accountability to someone to get it done. You can have all of the kind of awareness training and incentives, positive incentives in the world, but ultimately you need the accountability and almost the consequence management of it. If you don't do it, and the only way that can happen is through proper governance. But does anyone have experience in trying to develop those kinds of habit changes to just make sure that something is adopted? So, Lewis, what kind of things have you attempted to do to try and get BDD as a common practice?
Well, the problem is I'm from security, right? So I'm not in the developer community. So whenever I ask the developers, some of them say, "Oh yes, we do it," but then you ask to see the stories and you ask to see the things, and there's no substance behind it. So
right.
I think one of the biggest problems is fake agile. And fake agile is a big trouble, because you think you're doing something, you think you have a common understanding, and then you don't. And it's not immediately obvious that you're not. And again, I do have a discussion with my security architects every week. So my company has offices everywhere in the world. So I have every week one call in the morning, so that or every other week. So every even week in a month, I have office hours with all security architects in the morning, so that our colleagues in Asia can join in. And the next week we have office hours in the evening in European time, so that we can talk with the colleagues in the Americas. And through that, we do have a lot of conversations, interesting conversations, and we do see what's being built around the world. But we don't get the developers in these conversations. So we just get the security people involved in the conversation to tell us what they see. So you have the broken telephone, or what's the name of the game in English? The broken post office, where one tells a message and the other one retells the message and the other one tells the message. So
like Chinese whispers.
Chinese whispers. I don't know. There's different names for it in different languages.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of what happens. Sometimes we get to see diagrams of what they're building, but then one of the biggest questions always is, what are you building?
Yes.
And they show you the CI pipeline. Yeah, well, thank you, but that's not what you're building. And they show you the services. Yeah, but that's not yet enough. I need to know what are your IAM roles. I need to know your VPCs. I need to know your well-architected framework, basically. Security at every step at every layer, security everywhere along the chain. And that's kind of where we're at right now. That's the state of our discussions usually internally within the security architect community. What they discuss with the development projects themselves, I have no visibility again, because it's kind of this Chinese whisper game in which I tell the architect something, they tell something to the developers, and God knows what comes to the developers. What they hear and what they receive are different things.
That's interesting. I mean, those problems definitely sound like they're rooted within governance and management problems, because these are the symptoms I guess you're describing. I don't think, and people kind of chime in if you disagree, but I don't think they're going to be solved by, I guess, you just continuing to plug away at it as an individual. It's definitely one of those governance type challenges to ensure that it's treated importantly, because it's really critical, right? I mean, those fake guardrails, I mean, they give a false sense of security. They don't allow you to provide assurance or gain assurance. They inhibit you from doing your work. So, you know, that to me is kind of governance and management at its source. James and Matthew, I know you're kind of largely in this to learn from the experiences of others. What you're hearing so far, is this helpful? Is there anywhere that you think actually, based on what you've heard, you think you want to hear more about?
It's kind of handy getting this introduction to the security principles around the high-level production systems. Yeah.
Great. Okay. And James, I'm not sure if you're there, but hopefully, if you are,
yeah, I think it was helpful.
Good. And is there any kind of other area that you think, you know, you've heard and you thought, actually, I want to hear more about this?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, you know, I've definitely got some good ideas from the discussions.
Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. That's really good to know. Really good to know. So I'm just thinking about, you know, we've got 25 minutes, and I'm thinking in the next 25 minutes, and you know, the session can close before that for sure. That's no problem. But if you want to use the time, where do we think we can, as a group, apply the next 20-25 minutes? What areas do we think are actually perhaps left outstanding, or somewhere where we think there's a bit of a gap in terms of what we want to learn?
And also, what would be the next steps after this session?
Good point.
Have a think of that as well.
We mentioned a lot of documents, some of from within OWASP and some from outside OWASP. Can we correlate some of the things and try to figure out if there is a path, maybe, for doing this based on some of the documents we mentioned. Does that make sense?
Yeah, something we could do. We've noted so far ASVS, the OWASP Cloud Security, the ENISA Threat Cloud Assessment, and Lewis is kind of throwing in the CSA Cloud Controls Matrix as well. Ben Schofield, I don't think he's done it yet, but he's having a talk on how he's consolidating these various control frameworks into something a bit more comprehensive and all-encompassing. So there's quite a few that Lewis has listed there that could be quite helpful.
Yeah, those are the ones I mentioned throughout the session. So the first one is the threat cloud assessment, which helps to evaluate the risk of going into business with a given cloud service provider. Cloud and Controls Matrix is what you get from this Cloud Security Alliance. OWASP Cloud Security is the one that has Gherkin threats and controls matched. So it's a great way to have test-driven development conversation with developers. What else is there? Yeah, ASVS from OWASP is already there. ASVS from OWASP has, unfortunately, almost no cloud security requirements, at least not that I could see. And no containers or microservices requirements. So actually, since I forked this ASVS, one thing that we have, I just got today an email from some colleagues that are looking at NIST's container security document, 149 or 150, I don't know the number. And they actually are proposing amendments for the ASVS fork that we have. So I would probably bring that back into the community later through a pull request in ASVS itself.
That sounds really great, actually, Lewis. I'm sure that would be really well received and helpful for a lot of people.
So the thing is, I'm not sure how to mix them. So what I could do is show you how we have mixed them together, how we have put them together to create a list of threats that we consider relevant to us as a company.
That could be helpful.
Sorry, my small son is
next generation of the security people there.
I know. Let me bring up the document.
Sure. So do I need to stop sharing my screen so you can share yours?
Usually I can just take it over and just start presenting.
Great,
No
okay.
worries. At least that's my experience with Zoom, but depends on how it's configured, I suppose. Do I even have the right to present?
Let's try. If was that you? This isn't you. This is still David, right?
This is David. I'm still looking for the document. Just give me a second. I can show you a couple of images. Sorry, that's
okay. Our setting says only the host can overtake from the current presenter. So David will need to stop sharing for you to stop.
Okay, I'll stop sharing. There you go. There you go. I can see all of your beautiful faces again.
Yay!
Okay, so let me try to share my screen. Share screen. Yeah, that one looks fine. Cloud Threat Catalog. So please let me know if you can see. I will zoom in to make it.
Catalog.
Yes. So there's 19 threat categories that we took out of the ENISA document. So there's compliance challenges, isolation failure, malicious insiders, and a few more. But what I wanted to show are actually the diagrams we created. So based on the ENISA document, we get the left part. I'm not sure I can paint here. Oh yes, annotate. Can I annotate? Can I draw? Oh yes, I can draw. Okay.
We can all draw.
I see now. So basically, all of this that I'm doing here. Gracias. Qué rico café. I just got coffee brought by the family. Yeah, that's a great surprise, wasn't it? Gracias, mis vidas. So based on the left part, what I drew here is, let me get this out of the way. So the vulnerabilities and the compliance and the threats, in this case, compliance challenges, come from the ENISA document itself. So these are all possible things that can come up in dealing with a cloud service provider. And the things on the right hand are, annotate again, and now I want a different color. I choose red, not because it's bad, it's just to make a difference. All these controls over here come from the oh, sorry, it's horrible to paint like this. So this is these are controls from the cloud controls matrix. So that's how we have mapped one and the other. And we did this exercise. Now it will stay put like that. So there's 19 such diagrams that we created for all of the relevant things that we found. And these diagrams are all created by using, can I clear all drawings? Yes. These diagrams are created in GraphViz. So they're all defined as text files so that we can accommodate changes in this. And then we have a definition of what each vulnerability means. The threats is what we're discussing. So if I can blend in, how do I blend in the pages, the sections? Sorry, I'll have to scroll very fast. I mean, it's just 19 categories. So what we have to help the security architects doing the analysis is then define what the vulnerabilities are. So these vulnerabilities come directly, the definitions, from the ENISA document. And then we have a list of controls here, and the controls tell you what the control is for, where do you usually find this control, where this control is usually specified, and whether it changes, whether you make, whether you ask questions to the cloud provider or to the internal projects. So that's basically the thing that we have created for the cloud assessment. Again, this is looking mostly at the security of the cloud provider. And for looking at the security in the cloud, it's what we have threat modeling for, and what we have the ASBS now being worked towards a policy.
There's really
from ASBS.
This is really amazing to see. I hope people are seeing value in this. I certainly am. I was just thinking, as you was kind of describing this, the possibility of having almost like an extra column on the right-hand side. So where you've got possible controls, you've got a column around, well, how do you validate them? And that's where you can kind of bring in your ASVS or link to the controls you have in the CI/CD pipeline, for example. But this is really useful.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working at this for some time now. I've been trying to optimize the process, but I unfortunately don't have the the control of the process. I'm just like a very small fish in a very big pond. So this is my attempt at reducing friction for the security architects, so that they can better understand how this can be done. So what we actually ask of the architect is to forget about the left side and to analyze the right-hand side. So what we usually ask the analysts to look at is this, and to tell us, is the control implemented or not implemented, and how good it is implemented based on the given documents, or SOC 2 Type 2 report, or whatever the cloud service provider can deliver. And based on that, we have an internal mapping between each of these to all of this, which is hidden from the analyst. So based on your answer here, you get to analyze whether there are underlying vulnerabilities still present that you need to address in your cloud initiative. Does that make sense, or was it too complicated?
I really enjoyed it, and as you're kind of going through, I'm kind of wondering, where does this go next? How does this evolve for you?
Well, right now it's based on an Excel sheet, and right now, as I say, for me, if we are analyzing the cloud service provider, this is an analysis that has to be done basically once. AWS, boom, you know it. And based on the shared responsibility model, you still have to look at a lot, but that's something that you do looking more closely at either the well-architected framework or the ASVS. So is everyone aware of the well-architected framework?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so that's a series of principles from Amazon. So it's not related to a particular technology or service that Amazon offers. It's based on principles for getting the best out of the, yes, that one, the well-architected framework. So that's, there's a free training, there's white papers, there's every Ignite conference has at least 100 level on this topic. It's a great way to look at security in the cloud, the shared responsibility model from the security perspective. There's a security pillar and a continuity pillar. Those are great points to start with. So for me, I usually represent this as a house. For me, the cloud service provider is the place you bought upon which you will build your house. And once you build your house, that's the security in the cloud.
Yep, good analogy.
The land, yeah, the land. So that's the plot of land, actually. The plot of land that you got is, and then you have regulations, right? You do not build the same in Florida, where you get hurricanes and swamps, as in the Alps, where you have snow, heavy snow, and mostly solid rock and little to no earthquakes, right? So you build resilient against snow lavines, but you do not build against hurricanes as you would in Florida, or you would in Tokyo against earthquakes, right? So based on the cloud service provider, you have a burden to take care of whatever vulnerability is not taken care of by the cloud service provider, plus whatever you build on top, making sure it's well architected.
Mm-hmm.
So that's currently the direction I'm trying to take this towards.
That's really helpful, thank you. I know that's kind of, it's important to consider things like this for your migration to cloud, because what you're talking about here ultimately is your risk management processes and your application of controls, and making sure those controls are being applied proportionately. You're focusing on the right things. And these things are critical for planning the migration to cloud, but also operating in the cloud itself once you're there, both in the cloud and the cloud provider you're working with, or providers that you're working with. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. Thanks for presenting that, Lewis. That's great.
Welcome, a pleasure. Any other questions from anyone in the audience?
I think it's great work. Many companies
Yeah, I like it.
are not that advanced. But
Yeah,
you
but then
work
it's
with
very slow.
German, so the engineering, attention to detail is quite good.
Yeah, I think what's really critical for things like this, because you put in so much time and effort to make security consumable for certain kind of individuals in the business, like your architects and your technology teams and your DevOps teams. Being consumable is one thing, but embedding these behaviors in the business is really critical. And I guess it'd be good to hear from anyone on the things they've done to try and, I guess, embed these ways of working or ways of addressing risk in their businesses, because you do see time and time again when people create amazing artifacts like this and they just they sit on a shelf or they're not really used.
Yes, so that's the idea basically. So that's how we try to tackle this. So it's a risk management process in 2 stages, just as you would for your plot of land, right? So if you want to build, you need to get the permission to build on that plot of land what you want to build, because you might not even get permission to build, right? The municipal authority might not allow you because there are regulations for the neighborhood you're building. And then on the other hand, whatever you build has to stand at least its purpose, right? So it should be at least adequate for the purpose it is intended. And that's what we try to do in the analysis. So 2-step analysis, 1 cloud service provider, 2nd security in the cloud.
And when creating this, did you work collaboratively? I mean, it sounds like you're working collaboratively with your architecture teams and everything else, which sounds great in terms of kind of bringing you all together.
Yes, I mean, a consultancy did the first match between threat categories and cloud controls matrix.
Yep.
I had to take it apart to make the vulnerabilities evident, because they were not. And then the shared responsibility model is something that I'm trying to tackle. So since everyone is burdened with this process, there's a lot of energy invested in streamlining it and making it easier to consume. So that's kind of my advantage, in which I use the energy already present in the room to achieve my goal.
Yeah, that's great. That's brilliant. I'm conscious that we're almost wrapping up on time. Does anyone have any questions or final thoughts on everything that we've discussed?
Not me.
Okay. And I know there've been a few latecomers to the talk. Damien and Sharon. I'm not sure how much you would have got from the talk, but if you're there, is there anything that you were hoping to get out of this talk? I recognise that there may not be much time left, but it'd be good to capture that if you have anything on your mind. Okay, no, understood, no problem. So I guess unless there's nothing else, I propose that we get 5 minutes back, or perhaps longer.
I will need David to do the debrief video with me.
Okay.
Other than that, if you guys don't have any further questions, comments, you're free to get your time 5 minutes back.
Thank you. Nice talking to you guys.
Thank
See you
you.
in the next call. Bye-bye.
Thank you for a great contribution.
Thank you. Yeah, very useful, everything. Thank you, David.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.